Welcome to The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. Well, today is a day of tragedy. Americans are waking up to the death of 19 children and 2 adults at the hands of evil in a Texas town. Once again, we are faced with what do we do? What's going on in America with all of this type of nonsense? All of this tragedy, all this senseless shooting. This goes again in the wake of about 10 days ago, the Buffalo shooting, which was a different type of shooting, but still, we've got 2 side-by-side 18-year-olds that have just unleashed evil on the communities. And so we wake up, it's a time of tragedy. We do grieve with the families of Uvalde as they face unimaginable loss at the hands of evil. May the Lord comfort and guide the entire community during this dark time. But most of us want answers. We want to know what is going on in America today and in America culture. Well, long before these tragedies unfolded, I have been wanting to get this man on my podcast with me. He is Adam Russo. He's a clinical social worker. He is a speaker on children's mental health issues, and he's the author of Unwritten Rules. It's available on Amazon. Adam is a local man. He lives in the Naperville area. Is that correct, Adam?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay. So, and I brought him, I've been wanting to talk to him mainly about school issues, things that are happening in school systems, everything from what did it mean to mask children and what was that impact to them psychologically, to now social emotional learning and why are we having this push in the school system. And then, Adam, these 2 tragedies unfold. And you've got 18-year-olds barely out of school. And in fact, possibly the perpetrator in Texas, it seems like he may have dropped out of school. But at the root of this is something bigger than just putting social emotional learning in schools. There's something bigger going on here, Adam. I don't know that any of us have all the answers, but perhaps with what you've seen in your practice, can you give us some direction as to what's going on in our culture today?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we get to today, I mean, I think it's important to kind of back up a little bit. We haven't, as a culture, we haven't really adjusted to technology. And I think looking at it as what, we can look at culture today on one hand, but, we talk about that, but we've got to understand the lead up to today. And I think an important part of that is understanding, we've gone into the, starting in probably the 2000s, right, kind of the advent of the internet and email and all those kind of things. We've kind of moved into this information age. And the information age, which not only, has obviously information kind of at our fingertips with, news media and 24-hour cable news and what's on the, news sites. I mean, any content you want to find, you can get. But then the advent of social media, all of these different communicative things that we just didn't have before. And in the advent of now information, it's also made it so that our lives have become, with these tools, they've been made easier, right? I mean, if you think about, pre-internet, if we wanted to order something to our house, it would take like 4 to 6 weeks. And we'd say, all right, that's kind of what it is. But now with the internet, like we get mad if we can't get it like tomorrow, right? So what's happened in our culture over the past 20 years has kind of eroded the concept of delayed gratification. It doesn't exist anymore. And so what's happened with that is that we've all kind of played in to everything should be happening quickly and easily for people. We should feel good all the time. We should have good outcomes all the time. The idea of working through process is not embedded in our culture anymore. And when that happens, it makes it really hard for many kids and adults, honestly, to cope with. And when they struggle to cope, the lashing out gets to be sadly greater and greater. And I think that we've been seeing that over the past 20 years.
Wow, that is a great perspective. I mean, I think that you're absolutely correct, and I think that goes on to what you've seen in education. Honestly, I think that there's become a very leniency sort of attitude towards holding children responsible and accountable.
Yeah,
and they're getting like one pass after another, and 50% if you don't turn in anything, and it can go to the point where, well, it doesn't matter if you don't turn your assignment in on time. There's no degradation of your grade if you turn it in late. And so people procrastinate and they just turn it in late and they feel like they can do it on their own time and not there's not a stick-to-itiveness, I think, that you find in schools. And I don't know if that's playing into this stuff, but I think that it's messing up our children, quite frankly.
Yeah, well, and what you're talking about now, so we have that cultural change, right, with information and all of those things. Now what you're talking about is kind of how pop psychology kind of, it really infiltrated like the educational systems and athletic systems that probably in the early 2000s. Kind of the whole everybody gets a trophy phase that kind of started and never stopped, and that was kind of based off of like a sentence in a research in a research study that said kids perform well when their self-esteem is higher, right? Like or they perform better when the better their self-esteem is, right? Like, and on its surface, well, of course that's true, right? But the problem is that we've gone to ridiculous lengths to make sure that kids' self-esteems are always high. And the problem with that is that what we're trying to do is that we've actually kept them artificially high, not in any kind of real way. And so, as adults we'll say, I think most adults would agree with the statement of, something to the effect of, if you're going to be successful as an adult, success, whether it's personal, professional, whatever, if you're going to be successful as an adult, you've got to have emotional intelligence. But when we're spending our time helping kids keep their self-esteem artificially high, what we're doing is allowing them to experientially feel things like excitement and happiness, but we're only allowing them to kind of theoretically understand the concepts of, shame, guilt, embarrassment, disappointment. We don't want them to actually feel those things. We just want them to kind of know those words exist and kind of like the situation of why someone might experience them. But we don't want them to experience those emotions for too long, because then they're going to feel badly about themselves. And then if that happens, then all of a sudden we're worried about outcomes and all these other things. But we're not raising kids with really any type of emotional intelligence, because we're way too invested in making sure they feel good and feel successful all the time.
Well, and again, technology feeds that perception as well, because then now they have to look as good as everybody else on an Instagram post. They have to. They can now artificially make themselves look better through all sorts of medium, technically speaking, where they can add filters and whatever else, and and that's just not reality. So they live almost not in reality a lot of time.
They do, and what's happened then is, and this is where I'll go back to culture, right, and the whole idea of delayed gratification. If you really back this concept up, right, like, there was there's places in the world where this still happens, but let's take getting water, right? Way back when, like, you'd have to go dig a well, get water, bring it to your house. Right now, we take for granted that there's sinks, right, everywhere, right? We can get water. So delayed gratification was always about process. And so when you have now with young people, their every day, there's less and less delayed gratification, right? You want to look good in the picture, change the filter like you're saying, and boom, you take it. And then, guess what? Yep. Not only do you have to wait to get a comment, you're looking instantaneously to see how many people are liking what you just posted. So there's all this constant feed of stimulation of having to really feel good about oneself that kids experience. And the way to combat that is that as parents have to be more purposeful in teaching delayed gratification, because we can't count on culture to just teach it for them, right? Our culture used to have delayed gratification embedded within it. Think about
that's right.
Growing up. Think about growing up. If I want to hang out with my friends on a Saturday night, but when my parents are like, no, we're going to go to this family barbecue Saturday during the day, like, I would have to wait to get home in order to call my friends. I couldn't text them or call them or message them or whatever while I was out on a Saturday afternoon. There were no cell phones. But then when I got home, you call them, there were busy signals, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
everyone had, like, delayed gratification was everywhere. You just had to wait, and you had to just kind of deal with it. And all of that has been removed from culture, from our day-to-day, which, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think obviously there's been convenience and things like that have been good, but it has shifted, I believe, how parents should parent, which is why I wrote my book, because because I think that parents really have to go into parenting now with a real strategy. What are you trying to accomplish as a parent? Not just, think about, well, I'm just going to be here for my kids and make them feel good. Because you could, I think 30 years ago,
Right.
you could probably get away with that because culture would have embedded some of those other things. But now we can't count on that anymore. So I think there's way more responsibility that's incumbent on parents than there ever used to be. And I think for many parents, it's difficult.
Well, I think it's difficult for parents because it's harder for let's be honest, mom to stay home and dad to go to work and still be able
Hmm.
to afford to live and do some things that you need to do or want to do. And so that I mean I think that's part of the problem here is you've got a lot of kids growing up without engaged parents and no, I mean in some cases parents have to work because it's just so unaffordable. Government's made it more unaffordable to live. Taxes are out of control. And we know that really well here in Illinois. I don't know if
Yeah,
there's
and I
something
think
to the family structure now, is what I'm saying, on top of the technology boom, on top of sort of this
well,
absentee parenting attitude.
I think I think I would go probably break it down a little bit further in that so there's different demands on parents now. I think the problem is that I think that regardless of what a family structure looks like, I think obviously I think, and there's been billions of studies that
Hmm.
show two-parent families, kids perform better in a I don't know. Well, better is a relative word. I won't get into all of it, but I think that there's more stability. I think for many kids, just because of the nature of culture, that it helps. But in general, I think that I think if you have parents, whether it's a single parent or two working parents, if they are engaged and put their kids first and are going at raising their kids with a strategy, those kids will do well. The problem is that whether it's for a reason, but on the flip side, there's plenty of two-parent families, which in what in a stereotypical like nuclear structure, who don't really pay attention to their kids,
That's
and
true.
so it doesn't.
No, that's
So
true.
it's not really it's not really the
Oh,
structure per se. It's how invested are they in their kids. And again, I think there was more margin for error when culture was kind of working with you as a parent, but now as culture is almost working against you as a parent, you have to, as a parent now, be that much more invested in your kids and really making sure that the strategies that you want to use as a parent are being implemented by you, because they're probably not going to be anywhere else. And I think that's where the struggles come in. So obviously, theoretically, it would be easier with two parents who are invested versus, but then the single parent who's invested, the kids can have the same outcomes, but the difficulty is as a single parent, it's like doing it with one hand tied behind your back. And so that can be even more challenging. So that's where I think some of those family structure pieces come in.
so I mean, obviously, there's a lot that we don't know, both about the Buffalo shooter and the Uvalde shooter. Um, but is this something that you've ever studied before? Is there something that you have any insight into what triggers kids to do
Yeah, I
this? I mean,
mean, so
these
I,
people are 18; they're barely into adulthood. Is there, something that you can point to that you?
Yeah. So for a number of years, I did the risk assessments for a couple of local school districts on, are kids going to be a violent risk at school, and a lot of it was done in the wake of, it started off. A lot of the research started obviously after Columbine and kind of moving forward. And there's been, I think it was University of Virginia really came up with some, really specific points as to what are the things that you need to look for to assess risk.
Hmm.
And a big part of it was kind of, this depression, isolation, loneliness, that kids may be experiencing. And then the other part of it is like their outlets, their family support systems, right? It's not, and then their views of school, right? Like it was kind of compounding all these different points. And I would do a fair amount of these assessments. You'd be surprised every year how many, I would do locally. These kids, they had some of the signs, but then the issue though was always early intervention, because you talk to the kids and you could really diffuse these things pretty quickly once you actually start talking to them. Problem is, I think a lot of kids, they're able to stay under the radar because they're not typically acting out because they feel so lonely and isolated. These aren't the kids who are starting fights in the cafeteria. They're typically kind of those kids who are more introspective, staying to themselves. And they just have a lot, in their heads. And then again, the problem that happens is that when you combine, kids who are feeling lonely, isolated, depressed, feeling like they have no future, in a culture that's saying you have to have an accelerated success like today,
Right.
they get hopeless really quickly, and they feel defeated really quickly, and so they act out, I think, a heck of a lot more and than they used to, because I think any reasonable adult would say, no, there's no way that a kid would really should have any measure of significant success in their early 20s. I mean, if you think about life cycles of
Hmm.
I say success, I mean life cycles of professional development. I mean, ideally we're peaking when we're maybe in our 50s, late 40s, 50s, and then we kind of ride it out, and then we start declining again. That's kind of the nature of it, right? Because you're supposed to be retiring hopefully by 65 or so. So like that's the curve. But I don't think a lot of kids today come in with that expectation. They come in with the expectation of everything has to go great for me, and I can't do it. Now I know just from seeing some of the brief things about what happened yesterday in Texas, it sounds like it was a lot more complicated than that. There really was no family support, or some substance issues at home. There's a whole bunch of things going on, which only complicates it.
Right, and it's interesting. He did shoot his grandmother, so you're wondering. I haven't heard any update on what the parents' involvement was with the child themselves. So it's just concerning. On the Buffalo shooter thing, though, we know that he had an interaction with school officials. School officials actually highlighted the fact that he had written somewhat of a manifesto about wanting to hurt and maim other people, and then he was actually institutionalized for about a day and a half, and evaluated and then let go. I mean, you're talking about New York that already has a red flag law. I mean, I don't know what bigger red flag you could require before somebody was taken away his right to own a gun, but that didn't happen. And so, going back to the school situation, which is right why I really kind of wanted to have you on in the first place. I mean, we can't expect schools to be the parent. I don't expect that. I certainly don't want to pay for that type of service. At the same time, they do seem to have a frontline look into children. And so when you bring in this idea of social emotional learning, which is my problem with social emotional learning is it's not like it's a psychiatric evaluation that perhaps teachers and administrators who are mature adults and maybe trained in evaluating students' behavior. It's my problem with social emotional learning is that they want to push it onto children to then now self-evaluate or evaluate peers, and I have a problem with that. I think that's not their place. I don't think that's their burden, and so I don't know where this leads to in the end. If you are constantly harping on social emotional learning, does it then, I mean, the psyche of the child, is it like they always then looking for it? Like that there's a social emotional problem in others?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's my experience with it.
Okay.
I wouldn't. I think that I would say that because I guess here's the thing, right? It goes back to I think what I was saying before. I think that I think we have to be more conscious of more actively teaching some of these things now because of how culture is. But I think the problem is that there's this line between what are kids kind of learning at home versus what is happening at school. And I think, from a social emotional perspective, if I could draw it up the way I'd want to, I'd say, of course, every family should be able to manage this on their own. Because again, I think but then what happens is between families and school systems, we're all caught up in trying to make sure kids are feeling good. And so, and feeling confident and feeling all these positive things. And then what happens is, we don't we're at school and we're kind of doing these conflicting things, right? We want to teach social emotional concepts on one hand, but our practices are going to be the opposite of that.
Uh-huh.
They're going to be kind of, you know what I mean? And so even the way we do it is not aligned. Alignment would be here. We're going to do something on social emotional learning that talks about, feeling guilty or something. And then on the flip side, then what happens is that you actually have the staff at school enforcing things that kids do wrong, so they actually feel the guilt that they just learned about. The problem is we prevent the experiential piece of this emotion with young people in so many places, but yet we try to teach it at the same time. We're not even aligned with what we want to do with social emotional learning, which to me is what I think a big crux of the difficulty is with it.
Well, doesn't a conscience really start to develop by it needs to, at least it should start to develop by age 5 or 6?
Yeah, it does. But again, I think it's the idea of,
Which my
at
point is that
home.
the prior to even going to school, that conscience is starting to be developed by parents assessing a child's behavior and then making them understand guilt. I mean, I don't think that we need to like, hey, guilt means, here's the definition of guilt. Here's what it looks like. I mean, I don't think that we want that either. I think it's infused in everyday activity as to
It
what's
should
going
be.
on,
It should be.
and then
That
you're
was,
right though.
yes.
Those so instead of guilt or something, we basically, or like making them feel embarrassed for having turned in late grades or whatever, or getting an F. I don't know what it is, but I mean, it does feel like there's a leniency going on in schools instead that is, actually not beneficial to their overall social emotional well-being.
Well, and that's exactly it, because you're right. Young kids certainly should have that development. But then what happens is, let's say a kid kind of knows that they should feel bad about something they didn't do or whatever. But then it's always, they're told, whether it's by parents or educators or both, hey, that's okay, don't worry about it. And then they keep getting told it's okay, don't worry about it. So then what happens to their sense of guilt? Like, if everything's kind of okay all the time, there's really nothing to feel all that bad about. Then as they get older, then let's say that's happening at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Then let's fast forward to 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and then there's something that they have to feel bad about. They haven't practiced how to experience that feeling for 10 years. That's where that's what I'm saying. That's where the lack of alignment comes in. We're not, we would say that in order to really understand math, you've got to practice the problems. We're not having kids practice the emotions, the emotional tolerance of negative feelings. We don't have them do that. We just kind of seem to think that they should eventually be able to handle it because we've propped them up so much. But we're not allowing them the room to practice.
Well, this has been fascinating. So your book, Unwritten Rules, is for parents. And
it is. Yeah,
can you tell us a
it
little bit more about that book?
Yeah, so I wrote it from the lens of, we want kids to grow up and be successful, whether it's in their personal or professional lives. And there's things, and in my view, there's strategies that parents need to have when kids are young, that they have to just have to keep that strategy going forward as they grow up. And what I do is really I wrote a lot of short stories with lessons afterwards. With the idea of, this is what happened. I mean, there's stories I've heard from other families or, things like that. And just how do we, if you take this everyday occurrence, right, this everyday thing that most parents go through, how do we then as parents, or how should we respond, and why does our response matter? And we have to understand that. And that's why I put the lesson after each story, because we have to understand, what are we trying to get to? And at the end, I write stories about two adults that are acting in completely different ways. And you can see, going through kind of the stories of childhood, how adults can get into either of those buckets. And that's what, to me, is always so important. When our kids who are 5 years old today, if they're 40 years old tomorrow, how should they be acting? And it's not magic. We have we can have our hands in that pot, but we've got to be purposeful with it.
That's awesome. Well, I just ordered it on Amazon. I can't wait to read your book. Okay. Adam, just one last question about these two incidences that just happened, Buffalo and Uvalde. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously we're not discussing in a broader sense what's going on in terms of social emotional development. Most kids do not develop into mass murderers. So there's definitely something else that was going on in these children. There's psychological problems that are almost unpredictable, I imagine.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's it'd be nice to know, kind of really kind of digging in, what exactly led to all of it. I mean, I think, it's to me, it just really speaks to more the desperation that that people get to when these kind of things, unfortunately, when they happen. I mean, if you think about just how poorly someone has to, the state that they have to be in, it's really unfathomable. I mean, it's something that I can't, I can't wrap my mind around. I know that there's been, there's been a fascinating. One of the books I read over the years was a book called "Guilty by Reason of Insanity," and talking about how, regardless though of whatever mental struggles people have, they're always responsible for their behaviors. And quite honestly, I used to work a long time ago. I worked in residential treatment, working with kids who had failed out of they were in DCFS and they failed out of foster homes and group homes, and because of their really severe emotional and behavioral issues. And and every kid on there, every kid I work with went through horrific abuse, and they would they would punch people, hit people, unprovoked, all these kind of things. And the one thing that I believe really, I know I helped them really successfully discharge, many of them successfully discharge out of the program, was you can't use your history as a reason for your actions. That's just not something I got behind as a therapist, which I think is pretty I don't think it's very what's the word I'm looking for? Most therapists, I don't think necessarily would take that perspective. They tend to validate the history, which led to the behaviors. Kind of the opposite. I validated the history, but didn't validate the behaviors. And I worked really hard with kids to separate the two. And the ones that were able to do so were really able to do much better, and then eventually leave the program. So I think we can't just lean on, all the reasons, but the reality is people are still responsible, and we've gotten away from holding people accountable regardless of why they got to where they are.
Wow, that's great. Great insight. Okay, thank you so much for coming to my podcast, Adam. You've just been a breath of knowledge for all of our listeners here. And again, I'm going to encourage everybody as well to go ahead to Amazon.com and order Adam Russo's book, Unwritten Rules. You'll not regret it, no doubt about it. Adam, thank you for coming on the program, and we will definitely want to talk with you in the future as more things develop on the school front and in other areas.